Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Deviant Mind. This is your hosts, Dominika.
And this is Chris.
And sorry that we didn't put out an episode last week, but we had some major sound issues, and we are actually having to re-record the episode we did last week this week. And that episode is going to be on the disappearance of Susan Walsh, which is a very fascinating case. And we're doing it again. So sorry for the missing episode. And hopefully onwards, we'll have episodes every week coming.
Yes.
So this has been an interesting case, and actually was a case that was brought to us by Chris's mom. So thank you, Chris's mom, so much. She's a very fascinating lady.
Yes.
So yes, exactly. So
I get my love of these sort of things and the topics we cover from my mom.
Oh, that's awesome. That is awesome. I actually have to say that my mom, I remember with my mom, we used to watch the Wednesday or maybe Monday night movie of the week on ABC or CBS, and they were always murder mysteries.
Yes.
So I'm probably in that same boat.
Yeah.
So Susan Walsh was born Susan Young Merchant on February 18th, 1960 in Wayne, New Jersey, to parents Martha Young and Floyd Merchant. And she disappeared from outside of her home in Nutley, New Jersey on July 16th, 1996 at the age of 36. And she's been missing for 27 years. And she's not been found. She left behind a son on the day that she disappeared, who was 12 at the time.
Yes.
And as this case was a weird one, because the way that Chris actually brought it to me is like, hey, should we do the disappearance of this go-go dancer, stripper, vampire, mafia woman? I was like, what? Putting all those words together was quite fascinating. And this woman, Susan, was a very fascinating woman. She was a reporter for the Village Voice, which is now defunct. But if you've been online, the back page, I believe, was came out of the Village Voice after it was defunct. It was kind of one of the first papers where sex was sold on the back pages. And actually, episodes 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the Long Island serial killer, many of those women actually, they advertised in the back of the Village Voice, and then later on back page. And this case, like so many other cases, seems to have been a bit mishandled. And Arthur Merchant, her half-brother, sued the Nutley Police Department to release her case records, which they refused to do. And on the thing saying that it was an open case, they weren't able to do it. And just in February 16th, 2022, a New Jersey court finally mandated the release to the files to the family, because they had previously hired private investigators to help find out what happened to her, because her family say she would never willingly leave her son
behind. It is interesting to note that the files had been sealed for so long, and even though perhaps Susan's relationship with her brother may have been strained over the years, I mean, he still was very close and still loved her. And after so much time passes, you begin to wonder what happened? Why is this stalemate? As we've seen recently with the Stephen Smith case, you have some things have to be reinvestigated. They have to be open. But when something is sealed, I mean, the family certainly has the right to know what's inside. So as you said, they were actually these documents were unsealed. I'm sorry, they were sealed and then they became unsealed, as you said, by the Essex County Court. But there was a lot of pushing in order to do that. And a lot of, when you find out what was in this file, you understand why they sealed it for so long. I mean, as you just mentioned, so much mishandling. That basically she didn't.
Yes,
If they took
exactly.
seriously everything that came from witnesses and friends, this might have prevented her going missing, I feel.
Exactly. And with this case, which maybe is a little bit different than some of the other cases that we've talked about, there's a lot of what is true and what is fiction in this case, because there wasn't that much. There were some, it took a while for the newspapers to pick up her disappearance. And when it did, finally, it became a media sensation because of the fact of the kind of stories that she had worked on with the Village Voice. But there also, as we were researching, I found a book through the Wayback Machine from somebody who had actually gone to college with her that spoke a bit differently about her than her family did. And so, kind of, as you're parsing all of this information, you kind of start getting an idea of who the person was. But the documentation we have shows kind of two very, kind of different people being portrayed in the media. And, she was a very fascinating woman. And, so
and
that sometimes happens with very fascinating
different
women.
stories with regards to Susan Walsh as a person. There are also many conflicting and different stories surrounding the situation itself and how she could have gone. So but both go hand in hand. Like we have to learn more about her in order to actually realize how she could have gone missing. So that's also fascinating to me.
Exactly. So we will go into who actually was Susan Young Merchant Walsh. Something that I found in the paper was that her family spoke about how she had wanted to be a poet since she was a kid, that she was a very talented woman who could write, sing, and act. She was sweet and open-minded and non-judgmental. She was also intellectual and very interested in subcultures and giving the people within them a voice, which would come back later with the vampire story that the Village Voice actually refused to publish. But she helped her half-brother Arthur Merchant kind of find himself and helped him come out as gay. And he was always very thankful to her for that. Susan graduated from Passaic Valley High School in 1978 and went to school at William Patterson University studying English and writing. And she very quickly started working at the university newspaper. Now, she at this time was already having some issues with substance abuse. And because she was having a hard time making tuition, she began working intermittently as an exotic dancer and a stripper to get through William Patterson University. No, this is 1979.
Right. It's a later start paying.
Yeah, right. It's yeah. So she did finally graduate in 1988, but it took a while because she had a stint in rehab in 1985. She also got apparently pregnant and married, whether she got pregnant in rehab and married her husband, who was Mark Walsh, the brother of Joe Walsh, in 1984. Now, for many of you who don't know, Joe Walsh was a very famous member of the Eagles, a huge rock band in the 70s. So we're talking like full on rock star. And so she married his brother, Mark Walsh, who was also a
like an inspiring musician, right?
Musician. He was an
Yeah.
aspiring musician. He was also a house painter. And he did also have some substance abuse issues
Hmm.
because I
Yeah.
believe they met in rehab. And she, um, this is where things like where it was true and what was false. In this book that I found online from a very long time ago by a now journalist named Alfred Sullivan. He had written a book because he was actually her
At the
editor
paper, full paper.
um, at the paper at William Patterson University, and there was like a whole group of them. And when she went missing, he wrote this book about exactly kind of who Susan was, and Susan seemed to be quite the character. She, per his book, created a lot of drama to kind of get herself to be I think she got pretty close to being
And
editor
I beg
of
your
the
pardon.
paper.
He wrote this. He wrote this after
But
she
then
had gone
her
missing.
issues
Is
kind of
that
came.
right? Okay.
Yes, that is correct.
98.
He wrote this in, I believe,
Right.
97 or 98. And
Yeah.
again, it's no longer on his website, but I was able to find it through the Wayback Machine. And he spoke about how nobody kind of ever knew if the
Yeah.
story she was telling was true or not. Um, she claimed that she had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but then she also claimed that she had been diagnosed with histrionic disorder and I think manic depression. And she claimed she was an alcoholic, but then at the same time, nobody
Right.
really ever saw her drinking. So that when
Yeah.
she was always in bars and clubs because she loved telling stories and being kind of in the
Right.
milieu, in the center of everything. But she would have one drink and then
Yeah.
nurse the second drink through the entire time. But then she would pretend
Yeah.
she was drunker than otherwise she was. She was also apparently catnip for any man
Yeah.
that came into contact with her at the university, and that helped with her doing quite well as an exotic dancer and as a stripper. And she was able to make enough money to get through school. Now her dad, Floyd Merchant, he was a recovered alcoholic who had been through rehab twice, and he was the one that kind of sent her to rehab in 1985. There wasn't.
And they say that she had a tough childhood.
Yes.
By all accounts, they say her parents' breakup and divorce was very difficult. And I don't know much else about what that living situation was like, but apparently that's what drove her towards being kind of an introvert and being a poet and telling stories and using that as a way to get out her angst or her depression, what was going on around her. She was young, I believe, at the time. They were going just divorce.
Right. And she supposedly, her mom, who I could find very little information about, had been married about 4 or 5 times. There was a revolving door of men that were coming through the house, and seems to have quite affected Sue. Now, Sue, she was called Sue, but she had problems of her own. She worked as a scab for the Patterson News when they went on strike. She had an arrest in Haladon, I believe, New Jersey, for assaulting a cop. And this was all after the birth of her baby, David, which I believe he was born in 1986 because of, she had claimed to become totally clean by then. And she was like back on the straight and narrow, but obviously she was having some issues. She was trying to put a sex show together at Show World. So she had gotten quite deep into the East Village kind of mindset back then. She would wear all black and wore these very specific sandals. And she was very into the beat poets and kind of wanted to be in that place.
It also seems, if anything, maybe not the alcohol, but certainly prescription drugs and cocaine seem to be her vices of choice.
Yes, and she did after finishing college. She, as we spoke about, worked at the Village Voice as what they called a researcher.
And she worked closely with James Ridgway, the editor of The Voice.
Who, no, she did, yeah, exactly. She did, just to finish kind of her bio in a way, she did get a bachelor's degree in 1988, and she actually was working as a writer for engineering and business publications as she was trying to get her start. Again, she was quite intellectual and was able to write those kinds of things. And then she did these research, quote unquote, with Ridgway on his big story that came out about the Russian Mafia, who were allegedly, she did help pen an in-depth report about the Russian Mafia and how they were trafficking Russian and Eastern European girls into the sex industry in New York. And because she was herself still dancing, she was able to get these girls to really open up to her.
And also, when you were listing some of the freelance publications she was working for, in addition to the financial and the business industry, she also wrote for a kind of underground newspaper called Screw, which was published by Al Goldstein at the time. Mm-hmm. And that was, it was definitely racy at the time, but it was basically sex classified ads and interviews with porn stars in a newspaper format, which was like a first in New York City. So yeah, she wrote for them as well, which is also interesting.
And exactly. And she also, from my research, was also writing fiction for them in kind of like fictional pornography stories, I guess, or erotic, I think is what they were called. And she actually had an off and on again relationship with Goldstein. It was reported.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Which seemed kind of, that's how she, yeah, how she kind of worked. She, after this article came out, it was a very well-regarded article. So she thought she was on the rise and on the move in kind of this career that she wanted. And so she pitched this idea about the vampires, because back in the very early 90s, there was a huge, well, not huge, but there was an underground vampire community in New York City. And so they would gather and drink each other's blood. And
then apparently Ridgway claims that the cult would steal blood from blood banks.
I wonder if this has anything to do with Anne Rice's books coming out. It just kind of occurred to me that
it's around the same time.
It's around the same time, and they had this huge, I'm kind of very curious now, the Vampire Lestat.
Wow.
When it came out, because I'm wondering.
She could have written Interview with the New York City Vampire.
Yeah, right? Okay, so it was actually published in 1985, but I remember back in the early 90s, that's when I discovered Anne Rice. And I think she must have had a bit of a resurgence back then, because I remember her talking about that. And I'm kind of curious. I mean, it was a huge, I remember like people were just, everybody started dressing like all black, goth, and and then they remade Dracula a couple times. Yeah, so I'm kind of wondering if this was a bit of it. So she got really heavily into it, and actually, on the day of her disappearance, she was living with her 21-year-old boyfriend from the vampire community. He was staying with her and was one of the people who were interviewed. but she
Christian Peebo. Is that Christian Peebo?
yes, I believe so. But
Yeah.
going back, so she felt her career was on the rise at this point. So she had done the Russian Mafia story. She was kind of not deep undercover, but she was trying to get into this vampire community and kind of got into it.
Yeah.
Ridgway asked her to help with his book Red Light Inside the Sex Industry that he wrote with Sylvia Plaschke. And Sue believed she was the primary researcher and should have gotten more of a, I guess, like a byline for that. And
Yeah.
but she didn't, and that was a huge blow for her. And she kind of, it almost felt like after this period of time. So when she turned in her article for the vampires, Ridgway refused to publish it, saying that she was not objective at all.
Yeah.
So she
Yeah.
had that. And then she did not get the kind of credit she believed she should have gotten for Red Light Inside the Sex Industry. And she had even been in a documentary that you had spoken about titled Stripped
Yes.
that you found on YouTube.
Yeah. It's, I believe there were two different documentarians shooting, one German, one for the BBC, dealing with the sex industry. So she was already at the beginning of her research and diving in, she was already kind of receiving threats and being told, back off a little, but apparently that didn't stop her. She seemed like a woman who just lived on the edge. And I think, if your article gets rejected for not being objective enough, you're not given the byline, you're not given more credit than you deserve for a book, you got to go all in, I guess, is her thinking. Like, now I'm just going to completely not stop and drive to expose this truth. But it's a dangerous truth.
Right. It is definitely a dangerous truth. And she started getting very paranoid about the fact that she was being stalked. And this was around the time that she moved back to Nutley, New Jersey with her child. Her and her husband were kind of estranged and separated. And by some versions, they had been estranged for years. She lived above him in an apartment in Nutley, New Jersey, which from and I don't know what Nutley, New Jersey is like right now, but from the things that I read back then in the 90s, it was a place where mafia dons went to retire. So it still had a lot of strip clubs, go-go bars, kind of that kind of nightlife. It was a kind of a working class town, and she was convinced that she was being watched in some cases by the FBI, by the CIA, by mafia.
Was she an informant? I mean, that's the other thing. It's like there are all these avenues that you can take. But ultimately, she, with David, her son, and living above Mark, she would still have those windows of opportunity to get back into those worlds and continue to make these wild relationships that she did. And the threats and the stalking kind of occur around the time of her deep diving into the Russian Mafia sex trafficking connection. And her friend Melissa bore witness to, they were walking down the street and they did see a car following them and just stop alongside them and then speed off. So her friend Melissa claims like she had just kept thinking, oh my God, Susan's so paranoid. She must be back on drugs. She must be alcoholic after all these years of sobriety. But once she saw the car, she was like, okay, maybe she's, there's something to this,
Right. And I think I believe at the time of her disappearance, and I think from the research I did, about a month or two before her disappearance, she had started getting way cagier and more paranoid than she had ever been. She had dropped a lot of weight, like a significant amount of weight. And I believe she was telling people she was back addicted to Xanax as well as drinking, and that she was being followed. She refused to have so going back, she was not doing well in the month before she disappeared. Right. And none of her friends knew what was going on. Her son, who has never spoken in public about her mother, I did not see him anywhere, nor her husband. Now, she claimed that he was really no longer her husband, but she didn't have the $3,000 to pay for the dissolution of their marriage to get a divorce. So they kind of stayed together on paper only. But she had, per some accounts, a revolving door of boyfriends that also included police and the higher muckety mucks in Nutley, New Jersey, which was one of the theories why it took the cops 5 days to even come to her apartment to look for it. So on the day that she went missing, she went downstairs to talk to her husband. It was a hot summer day, July 16th, 1996. And she asked her husband to watch their son David while she ran out to the payphone, which was supposedly right across the street from their apartment.
Yes. She said, I'll be back in half an hour.
Yeah, exactly. And she left her wallet, her keys, and her pager. That's what she had. She had a pager. She'd never had a cell phone because she, I found, was a big fan of Abby Hoffman from the 70s. He was a kind of underground comedian. I believe he was a comedian, activist, somebody. And he was very weary of phones because he felt that they could be listened on, both public phone or cell phones specifically. And back that he was in the 70s, he thought that any public payphone you should be aware of because you should, you might be listened to. So she had this tendency to go to a bank of phones. Now, of course, this is for people, your younger listeners. There used to be banks of payphones.
Yes. And wasn't it a shock when they raised the price from 10 cents to 25 cents?
Yes, exactly. Oh my goodness. Yeah, so much to call. And then you'd have to keep feeding it because you only had a certain amount of time. So there were these banks of payphones, and she would go down the lines of the phones, making her calls at a different payphone each time to make sure that, she was covering her bases as far as not being listened to. So again, she was...
As a testament to how she and Mark got along, I do have to say, I commend them for wanting to live close to, they wanted to live close by to one another for David's sake.
Absolutely.
But I think that's pretty cool, as estranged as they were, and obviously he probably did not in the least agree with the lifestyle, her lifestyle rather. At least they came together over David to say, hey, we're going to be here for him.
Exactly. So unfortunately that day she never came back. And, it took a while for people to actually list her as missing because she had the tendency to disappear for days on end when she was in college and then turn up again. It seemed kind of like it was a thing for her to do, especially if she caused a specific amount of drama between individuals and then felt like she needed to go away for people to cool off. So at first, I think people in her life thought that that's what she did. But then when she was finally listed missing, it took the
Mark
cops.
called it in, by the way.
Mark did
her
call it in.
husband,
Okay.
Yeah, he called it in.
It took them 5 days to come and actually look through her apartment. They did interview Mark as well as Christian, who was the vampire that was living with her. I'm assuming they also questioned Melissa, who was her bestie at the time. And I believe there was a woman that lived above her that also they interviewed, but they really couldn't tell them anything except for the fact that Sue had, lost a lot of weight, had started maybe doing substances. And I think the cops put her down to, she's a grown woman. Maybe she wanted to leave her life behind. And so they didn't take it very seriously.
Yeah.
Now, her family said that she would never have left David like that, that David had been her whole life, and she cared so much about him that just disappearing like that out of his life, it would never happen. Now, some of her other friends believe that, like maybe the mafia did get to her, or she had dated shady men. She had actually worked as an exotic dancer and a go-go dancer in New York City, as well as Central Jersey, as well as like small towns on the border. Because
go
ahead.
Go ahead.
But she was 36, and that kind of dancing typically has an age, kind of like an age ceiling, and she had hit it. And most women stop by the time they're 30, and she was 36. And from what I was reading, she was having a harder and harder time getting gigs. And people weren't sure exactly what she was doing for money. And then there were some friends, and again, we don't know if this is true or fiction, because some of it's in the paper, some of it's online, some of it's in this guy's book. They thought that because she had dated policemen in Nutley and kind of the people in the mayor's office, that they kind of put a kibosh on the investigation to make sure that none of them would be implicated.
And let's face it, I'm sure the department was aware of her articles and her deep dives, and maybe there was a bit of like, hey, we should be investigating this Russian Mafia, or why is she going so hard on the Russian Mafia? Like, so she's five at the time of her disappearance. She's 5'6" and weighs 110 pounds.
Yeah.
I found out she had a really thick New Jersey accent. What was sealed in that file actually is the police checked the payphone records of the payphones across the street, and there were never outgoing calls at the time of her disappearance. So that window of time where she says, I'm just going to go make a call, the phones were never used.
Oh, that's interesting.
So that was sealed in the folders. And when the cops eventually came, they found her day-to-day calendar, or her weekly calendar, had the entire month of July ripped out from it.
Right. Which
so there was no indication of why, who did that. And as you said, they did interview Mark, but it wasn't an interrogation. It wasn't what you would expect the police, a conducted interview from the police, from the spouse, right? I mean, you always look at the spouse or the ex-spouse, and but apparently there was just kind of like, oh, okay. There was no checking into him until years later, once the files are unsealed, and it's like 2022, 2021. They did try to get his DNA. They went to his house, and he refused because he said, I don't want to do it at home. David's here. I don't want to get him involved. He shouldn't be exposed to this. And it was never followed up. No one ever told him, oh, well, then can you come in? Like, come into the precinct and we'll do it there. There was never, it just stopped. Like, once he was like, I don't want to do it, in my home. That was it. They never followed up.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which is very
and
strange.
yes, and then weren't you saying something about them wanting to dig up his Walsh's, the husband's father's backyard for her remains at some
Yes.
point?
Yes. Apparently, there was a bit of land behind Mark's dad's house in Montclair, New Jersey. And Susan, according to Mark, would like to go. She would go there and just sort of clear her mind, and she liked to be there. So one theory has it that if he is responsible for her disappearance, that she could possibly be buried in the back of his father's land, the back of the house. And they were going to, again, in 2022, it was proposed that they do the heat sonar surveillance of from a helicopter. They're able to look down and find bodies or heat sensors or anything like this. I don't know what's going on with that. I haven't heard any updates about, but that is something that they wanted to do because it's there's some sort of weird connection there. So he's.
But did they ever say like why in the backyard of his dad's house?
Like, there's never been like an official reason why he should or shouldn't be a suspect.
Right.
And the theory that she's buried in the back of his father's yard, I just don't know where that comes from.
It just seems like there's either. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, unless he was just enraged by her lifestyle, seeing all these different men, getting involved with drugs, and it's a mess, and I don't want to expose our son to this. I mean, that's the only motivation I can find or motive for him to have anything to do with her disappearance. But again, right. as we said at the top, like there are just so many different theories. And, another thing was one of the folks that she thought was actually stalking her was this guy named Billy Walker. Mm-hmm. And Billy Walker was her on-again, off-again boyfriend. And they kind of started hooking up over drugs. And he had told her, I chop up bodies for the Russian Mafia. Like, I do whatever they do. So she was kind of like drawn to that. And she was like, oh, crazy, And so they had this torrid affair. They're doing coke together. She had in her mind that because he was just so stalky and wouldn't leave her alone, that she would play him by telling the Russian Mafia that she knew, hey, Billy's squealing. He's kind of a rat. Like, I'd be careful with him, with the hope that they would, whack him, get rid of him, make him disappear.
Yeah.
So that's what they say, or that's what she actually said it to someone, I don't know who, but she said that was her plan, was to get him and to get him killed through blackmail that she had on the Russian Mafia. Like, if you don't take care of Billy, then I'm going to tell blah, 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 blah.
Which she was playing to kind of like, because they supposedly had huge fights. Yeah, that's right. Billy Walker also, it sounded like they kind of got physical together. And yes. In fact, there was evidence that Christian Peppo
threatened her.
Yeah, that Christian Peppo said that she told him, and he was the vampire that was living with her at the time, that it was Billy Walker. She was really afraid of him. That she was being stalked and harassed by him, and that Walker was also a coke addict who ran with a biker gang, and and he supposedly
she recorded a phone call. She recorded him threatening her. They gave it to the police. She gave it to the police, and they did absolutely nothing. They never followed up. They did absolutely nothing. And that came from Christian Peebo, because he said, told him the whole story. And he couldn't believe that the cops did not. She had the tape. She had the tape of him.
And supposedly he called several times in the weeks before she disappeared. And so Christian actually blamed the cops that like, hey, she came to you guys and you did nothing
Yeah.
and now she's gone and she probably killed her. But they never brought him in, and they obviously have never been able to find her body. I think personally, for me, I personally think she's passed away and was probably murdered by somebody. I don't think she left her son, especially, she's been missing for now 29 years. I think she would
Right.
have turned up. And so I do. And Billy Walker seems to me the best man for the job, I guess. Like, it just seemed like,
yeah.
Yeah. And because she had the tendency to drive people crazy. And again, this was from that book that I found. So we don't know if that's true or false, but from some indication from people that knew her in college, that she had a knack of really getting under men's skin. And so if you get under the skin of a coke addict who is also in a biker gang, who also hides bodies for the mafia, who is now calling you repeatedly and saying that he's going to kill you, I'm thinking maybe he probably did that.
Yeah. I mean,
who do you think? What do you think happened to her?
I mean, I do think there are just, we have the cops, the other theory is that she's alive, that she just wanted to completely reinvent herself, get out of it. She runs the risk of exposing herself if she makes any contact with her son, which I'm sure is killing her. But her friend Melissa claims that she saw her. I don't know the year, but it was obviously, pretty, a few years removed from her disappearance. Saw her, called out to her. The woman did not respond. Saw the woman get into a car. Melissa got the license plate. They checked the license plate. And they talked to the driver, because there was a driver in the car she got into, and they showed her. He was shown a photo of her, and he says that he's pretty sure he recognized her.
Oh, okay.
But once again, that was a trail that just it went dead.
Yeah.
So one police theory is that she's alive, and she just wanted nothing to do with this anymore. She was fearful of her life. Maybe that's why she leaves David, because she fears that they could do anything. She wants to protect her son.
Right. That's actually a very good point.
Ridgway and some of her friends think it's completely also possible that she overdosed.
Right.
Maybe perhaps even overdosed with a friend. Friend freaks out, doesn't know what to do, so they somehow get rid of her body. Or she may have overdosed somewhere completely remote and we just haven't found her body.
But I would think that, some of these areas that she went missing in are, they're pretty populated. So you would think that some part of her body would have showed up in the last 29 years as people started developing land or, doing construction.
Right.
And because that was always my theory. It's like, well, if she did overdose or if she committed suicide, like, where's her body?
Exactly. And, they, aside from those ideas, her father feels that it was the Russian Mafia that's responsible for her death. Whether or not that means maybe they hired Billy Walker to do it.
Yeah.
Or
maybe
whomever.
Billy Walker actually said, hey, I could, get rid of this problem for you.
Right.
And so,
because maybe they, the Russian Mafia could say, to him, like, hey, I think, this girl's no good. She's kind of getting too close and she's telling us that you're a rat. I mean, who knows? But I think her father's a theory that I gravitate towards the most because the Russian Mafia is pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Pretty powerful. I think that they could get the authorities in their pocket rather easily.
Just because they have so much money flowing through.
Money and corruption. Just, cops can remain silent, look the other way, especially if they're sex trafficking these women. And it is interesting to note when you were talking earlier about the various clubs that she would dance, the New York City clubs they were allowed to be topless, the dancers. And she wasn't too keen about that. So in Jersey, there's a no topless law. So she preferred to just go dance and get to, the pasties or lingerie rather than. And then may have also been because she's getting older, as you pointed out. So, she lived her life on the edge, and there are just so many ways this can go. But I just think because she was so invested and so just dedicated to exposing all this to a point where even if she's not working for a publication, I feel like she's still involved in that world.
Right.
Which is interesting. Right. It's like now, like my article's been rejected. This book came out. I don't have any good thing going on. I'm going to go back to dancing. But I'm still going to get in this world because I still have to get to the bottom of this. And she was bipolar, but had refused, or rather stopped taking her medications about 2 weeks prior, they say, to her
when she disappeared. It's definitely, I think one of the things that I read was that she wanted to fully turn her back on middle class, like the middle class life that she grew up in with, even her broken homes. Like she grew up very middle class, and that was the last thing she wanted to do, is just be normal, be middle class, be stoogey and boring. And she as you said, lived her life on the edge, on her terms. And it was unfortunate that she disappeared like she did. And hopefully her body, or she, will be found at some point. I'm sure that her son would, love to have his mom again. He, as we said before, both him and his dad have never really been in any of the articles about her. Like it's just complete radio silence from that side. Yeah. And I mean, again, somebody just going missing on an afternoon. It's
weird also because it took, I think it took 10 years before the Village Voice published an article regarding her disappearance and who she was. So I find that to me is a bit odd as well, that they would wait so long to be like, hey, remember Susan Walsh? Yeah. It just seemed like there was no sort of send out the hounds. Like, oh, where is she? There wasn't an urgency. Right. And as we know, a lot of that probably has to go with her dancing and her being involved in the sex industry. People seeing her around at vampire clubs. Yeah. I mean, it's easy to dismiss as opposed to say, and we've discussed this before, your white Anglo-Saxon female, blonde, blue eyes, goes missing.
Like housewife goes missing, and they're like, oh, we got to find something. Right, exactly.
But even in those cases, a lot of it is driven by the parents, the family of the missing. That is what makes this so unusual, is his silence, his son's silence. The brother not saying really anything, or her parents, until way after the fact.
Right, exactly. Which kind of makes... Well, it almost makes me wonder if they actually really did think that she just skipped town and they just didn't want to make a fuss so she wouldn't come back to like a shitstorm when she came back.
Right. I mean, it's... I'm glad we're talking about this case just because there isn't a lot of information or exposure to this case. As we've mentioned in the past, this show called Disappeared did a piece on her, and Unsolved Mysteries at the time did a piece on her. It's really funny because I guess it aired in 96 on Unsolved Mysteries. Robert Stack talks about her case, and then the next case was, and where's JonBenet Ramsey? And I'm like, gosh. Wow, remember this time? Like, what a crazy time that was. That
was a crazy time. Well, thank you guys. This was, very fascinating case to talk about. And I don't know if Chris just segued into our next case of JonBenet Ramsey, if we actually want to go down that.
Whoa.
Go down.
Your friend is right, by the way.
Oh, yeah?
Without saying anything to our listeners, Your friend is right.
Oh, because we have some kind of insider information about that.
Yes.
But so, any case, thank you guys for joining us, and stay tuned for next week when we will give you the word on the street about what actually happened, I guess, with Jean-Benet Ramsey. We're just going to go wading into that. So thanks again, and we'll see you next week. This episode was sponsored by The Creek Killer, Book 1 in the Harriet Harper thriller series written by me, Dominika Best. What would you do if you read the police found your body in a creek? Find out in The Creek Killer, available on Amazon. Thank you for joining me and listening to this episode. If you like my show, please give me a rating and review. It helps other listeners find this podcast. Follow Dominika Best Presents The Deviant Mind wherever you listen to your podcasts. Visit thebeststorytellingnetwork.com, where you'll find show notes, my books, links to social media, and much more. Join my Patreon for special subscriber perks, like 2 extra exclusive episodes a month and a Q&A with me at patreon.com/The Deviant Mind Podcast. Until next time.